He didn't even wait for her trunk to hit the platform. Nathan Caldwell took one look at Clara Whitmore's face, at the scars that ran from her left cheekbone down to her jaw, and his expression didn't just fall. It curdled. Like something inside him decided in the span of a single heartbeat that this woman, who had traveled nearly 2,000 miles on his written promise of a life together, was simply not what he ordered. "You should have told me," he said, loud enough that 3 people on the platform turned to look. Clara stood very still. The kind of still that comes not from calm, but from a person who has learned that moving too fast when the world is collapsing tends to make things worse. "I did tell you," she said quietly, "in my 3rd letter." He shook his head like she'd said something foolish, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a folded envelope of bills. He held it out toward her the way a man holds out feed for an animal he's decided isn't worth keeping. "There's enough there for your return ticket and a few nights somewhere decent." If you have ever been handed money in place of an apology, you know the particular silence that follows. You know how it feels to stand in a public place while someone reduces every letter you ever wrote, every hope you ever carried, every mile you ever traveled, down to a number they consider fair. Clara did not take the money. And that small, quiet refusal is where this story really begins. If you were standing in her shoes that morning, what would you have done? Because what Clara Whitmore chose to do next changed not just her own life, but the life of an entire town that had forgotten what it meant to look past the surface of things. If this is your first time here, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is only getting started. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to that platform in Red Hollow, Montana, and let's not look away. The morning Clara Whitmore arrived in Red Hollow, the temperature was sitting somewhere between sharp and brutal, and the sky had that flat, pale color that Montana gets in early spring when winter hasn't quite decided to leave. The station platform was weathered wood and peeling paint, and it smelled like coal smoke and horse, and the particular dusty dryness of a place where the wind never really stopped. Clara had been awake since before dawn. She'd sat upright in her train seat for the last 4 hours, watching the landscape change from familiar rolling farmland to something wider and emptier than anything she'd known growing up in Ohio. She wasn't afraid of wide and empty. She'd grown up poor enough that wide and empty sometimes meant quiet, and quiet was not always a bad thing. What she was afraid of was the moment she was moving toward right now, the moment a man she'd never met in person would look at her face for the first time. She'd been afraid of that moment for most of her adult life. The scars had come when she was 19. Her younger brother Tommy had been asleep in the back bedroom when the kitchen wall caught fire from a grease pan left too close to the stove. Clara had not thought about it. She had gone in through the smoke and the heat and the orange wall of it before anyone outside could stop her, and she'd gotten Tommy out with nothing worse than a burned arm and a coughing fit that lasted 3 days. Clara had not gotten off as easy. The left side of her face had taken the worst of it. The doctors in the county hospital had done what they could, and what they could do in 1882 in a rural Ohio county was not much. The scars that remained were not subtle. They were the first thing people saw when they looked at her. They were sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the only thing people saw. She had learned to carry herself in a way that accounted for this. Not to hide. Hiding had never worked, and she'd stopped trying it years ago. But to present herself with enough steadiness that people had something else to look at. Her posture. Her eyes. The way she spoke, which was direct without being hard. Nathan Caldwell had written her for 8 months before asking her to come west. The letters had started through a respectable correspondence agency in Columbus, the kind that matched women in difficult circumstances with ranchers and landowners in the territories who needed wives with some education and practical sense. Clara had answered his first letter carefully, explaining who she was, what she could offer, and what she carried, including the scars, briefly, plainly, without apology. She'd mentioned Tommy and the fire in her 3rd letter, just as she'd told Nathan this morning. His reply to that 3rd letter had said, "A person's past is their own business. What matters to me is what kind of woman you are going forward." She had read that sentence many times over the following months. She realized now, read it the way a thirsty person reads a map to water, with so much need that she hadn't stopped to ask whether the map was reliable. 8 months of letters. She knew the shape of his handwriting. She knew he preferred beef over pork, that he'd built his ranch from a single plot of dry land he'd bought for almost nothing, that he had a younger sister in Billings he didn't see enough, that he believed hard work was the only honest currency a man had. She had trusted those letters. She had trusted the man who wrote them. The train stopped. Clara picked up her traveling bag. She smoothed the front of her coat, dark wool, well-made but old, the best she owned. She set her jaw the way she always did when she was walking into something difficult, and she stepped off the train onto the platform of Red Hollow, Montana. Nathan Caldwell was waiting on the platform exactly where he'd said he'd be, near the east end by the water barrel. He was taller than she'd imagined, with broad shoulders and the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work. He held his hat in his hands, and for one moment, just one, something that might have been anticipation moved across his face. Then his eyes moved to hers, and the anticipation went somewhere else entirely. She watched it happen. She had watched it happen dozens of times in her life, and it never became something she could brace against adequately. It was not always disgust. Sometimes it was pity. Sometimes it was that particular discomfort people showed when they didn't know where to look. With Nathan Caldwell, in that first unguarded second, it was something colder than all of those things combined. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. A woman nearby, someone waiting for her own party, glanced over and then quickly away. A young boy sitting on a barrel stared openly until his mother pulled him around by the shoulder. Nathan's jaw worked for a moment. He looked past her, at the trunk being unloaded from the baggage car, and then back at her, and she could see him calculating something. She had seen men calculate like this before, too. It was the math of inconvenience weighed against the cost of a scene. "You never told me," he said. It came out almost like a complaint, like she'd showed up short on some agreed-upon measurement. "I told you in my third letter," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "I told you about the fire and about the scars. I told you they were visible." "You said scars." His voice had gone flat. "You didn't say." He stopped himself, but the shape of what he hadn't said was right there in the air between them. "I didn't say what?" Clara asked. He didn't answer that. He looked down at his hat for a moment, turned it once in his hands, and then looked back up with an expression that had gone from cold to decided. "I don't think this is going to work," he said. She had half expected it. She had told herself on the long train ride west that she should be prepared for the possibility. But there is a difference between preparing for a thing in theory and the actual moment the thing arrives, and the actual moment hit her with a force she had not anticipated. Her trunk was sitting on the platform behind her, her trunk with everything she owned in it. "You've made up your mind," she said. It wasn't a question. "I think it's better to be honest now than to—" "You made up your mind in about 4 seconds, Clara said, after 8 months of letters. He had the decency, at least, to look briefly uncomfortable. "Miss Whitmore, those letters were honest," she said. "Every word in them. I don't know what you think you're looking at right now, but whatever it isn't who I am. I understand you're upset." "I'm not upset." She wasn't, quite. She was something harder and colder than upset, something that hadn't fully named itself yet. "I'm just pointing out that you made a decision about a person in the time it takes to shake hands." He reached into his jacket and produced the envelope. He held it out and said the thing about the return ticket, and Clara looked at the envelope, and then she looked at him. At this man who had written 8 months of letters about character and honesty and a person's worth. And she did not take the money. She left it in his hand. She turned and walked to the far end of the platform, and she stood there with her back straight and her eyes on the mountains, and she listened to the sound of the train starting up again behind her, and she did not cry. She was not going to cry on that platform in front of those people. She would perhaps cry later, in private, when she'd found somewhere private to be. For now she stood and watched the train pull away and asked herself the most practical question she could think of. What do you do now? She had the money in her traveling bag, her own money, not his, not enough for a return ticket, not with the room and board she'd paid getting here, enough for maybe 2 weeks of careful living, if she was very careful, and found something cheap quickly. She had the contacts the correspondence agency had given her, a list of businesses and respectable establishments in Red Hollow that were known to be fair to newcomers. She had her training. 7 years teaching school in Ohio before the district board had quietly suggested she might not be the right face for their institution. 7 years of lesson plans and children's handwriting and ink-stained desks. She had herself. It was not nothing. She turned from the mountains and looked at the town of Red Hollow spread out in front of her. One main street, maybe a dozen buildings, raw wood and mud and the smell of livestock. A hard, unglamorous, unsentimental place. She picked up her traveling bag. She was going to need to find that list. She had taken maybe 4 steps when she heard boots on the platform behind her, unhurried, deliberate, and then a voice that didn't belong to anyone she'd spoken to yet. That was a poor piece of behavior back there. She turned. The man who'd spoken was standing near the platform steps, one shoulder against the post, watching her with the kind of look that wasn't intrusive so much as direct. He was tall, rangy, with the lean kind of build that came from outdoor work over many years. His face was weathered and marked. There was scarring along his left jaw and down his neck, old and settled the way scars looked after enough years. And he held his hat in both hands with a patience that seemed to come naturally to him. He was not looking at her face the way Nathan Caldwell had looked at it. He was looking at her face the way you look at a person. "Pardon?" Clara said. "That man," he said, nodding in the general direction Nathan had gone. "That was a poor piece of behavior. I'm not trying to stick my nose in. I just—" He paused, considered his words. "I saw what happened, and I found that sometimes it helps to hear somebody say that out loud." Clara studied him for a moment. She was not naive about strangers. She had learned over the years that pity could wear many different faces, and that some of them were more dangerous than outright rejection. But this man did not look like pity. He looked like someone who had simply decided to say an honest thing. "It wasn't the finest hour I've ever witnessed," she agreed finally. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. "Cole Maverick," he said, and extended his hand. "Clara Whitmore," she said, and shook it. His grip was firm, without being demonstrative, and his hand was rough from work, and he did not hold it a moment longer than the handshake required. "You have somewhere to be?" he asked. "I'm looking for somewhere to be," she said honestly. "I have a list of establishments the agency gave me. I was about to start working through it." He nodded slowly. "Martha Bell's Cafe is at the north end of the main street. She's a fair woman. She'll give you an honest answer to an honest question." "Thank you," Clara said. He nodded again, settled his hat back on his head, and stepped off the platform and toward the hitching post where a dark horse was standing with what appeared to be complete indifference to everything going on around it. Clara watched him go for just a moment, then turned back toward the town. She had arrived in Red Hollow with a fragile hope and found it broken inside the first 5 minutes. What she had not expected, stepping off that platform, was to find herself thinking, through the shock of what Nathan had done, through the cold of the morning and the uncertainty of what came next, about the way one stranger had looked at her face, not past it, not away from it, at her. She started walking. Martha Bell turned out to be a compact, efficient woman in her 50s who listened to Clara's situation over a cup of coffee without interrupting and without letting her expression do anything Clara would have to respond to. When Clara finished, Martha was quiet for a moment, refilled the coffee cup, and said, "I need someone for mornings, 6 to 10. Setting up, prep work, taking orders when it gets busy. It's not glamorous and it doesn't pay enough, but it's honest and it's a start." "I'll take it," Clara said. Martha looked at her steadily. "You're not asking how much." "I know what a start is worth," Clara said. "I've made a few of them." Martha nodded, something shifting slightly in her expression. "There's a room above the stable at Henry Cole's place. It's not much, but Henry is a decent man and he doesn't charge more than he needs to." Clara arranged it that afternoon. The room was small and cold and smelled like horses, and it was hers, which was what mattered. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed that evening with her trunk against the wall and her traveling bag open in front of her, taking inventory. Her good dress. Her teaching materials. 3 textbooks, a set of chalk, a composition notebook. The letters. She considered the letters for a long moment, and then she put them at the bottom of the trunk beneath everything else, because she wasn't ready to decide what to do with them yet, and she wasn't going to make that decision tonight. Through the thin wall, she could hear horses shifting in their stalls below. The wind picked up outside and pushed through a gap somewhere near the window frame, and she found a rag and stuffed it in, and that helped. She thought about Nathan Caldwell's face in that first moment. She thought about the envelope in his hand. She thought about Cole Maverick's eyes looking at her like she was a person. Outside, Red Hollow went about its evening business, unaware that the woman who'd been publicly abandoned at the train station that morning was sitting above the livery stable quietly deciding that she was not going to disappear. She had survived worse than this. She had walked into a burning house when she was 19 years old. Red Hollow, Montana, was not going to be the thing that finished her. She lay back on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the horses breathing in the dark below. And she made herself no grand promises. She did not tell herself everything would be fine. She did not look for signs or omens or reasons to be hopeful. She simply decided that she was staying and that tomorrow morning she would get up at 5 and walk to Martha Bell's cafe, and she would do the work, and she would figure out the rest as it came. That was all. That was enough. In the morning, Red Hollow would wake up and find that the abandoned woman was still there, and Nathan Caldwell, across town in his fine ranch house, would discover, slowly, over the weeks and months ahead, that leaving someone behind on a platform does not make them go away. Sometimes it just means you no longer get a say in where they go next. Martha Bell did not ask questions Clara wasn't ready to answer. That was the first thing Clara noticed about her, and it mattered more than she could have explained to anyone who hadn't spent years fielding looks and comments and well-meaning inquiries that were really just another way of saying what happened to you. Martha saw what she needed to see on the first morning, that Clara showed up on time, that she worked without being told twice, that she didn't drop things or complain about the cold or treat the cafe's regulars like they were beneath her, and that seemed to be sufficient. The morning crowd at Martha's was a particular kind of rough and functional. Ranchers who'd been up since 4, tradesmen stopping in before opening their shops, a few women who came in pairs and spoke quietly over their coffee, and watched Clara with the careful sideways attention of people who had already heard the story of what happened at the train station and were deciding what to make of it. Clara had expected that. Word traveled fast in small towns. She'd grown up in one. She moved through the room with the coffee pot and kept her face neutral and her eyes level and said good morning to the people who said it to her and said nothing to the ones who didn't. And by the end of the first week, she had a fair mental map of who in Red Hollow was worth worrying about and who wasn't. Nathan Caldwell's name came up 3 times in that first week. Once from a rancher who mentioned a land deal in passing. Once from 2 of the watching women, in a tone that Clara chose not to hear from across the room. And once from Martha herself, on a Friday morning when the cafe had emptied out and Martha was refilling the salt shakers and Clara was wiping down the counter. "He's been in twice since you arrived," Martha said, without looking up from what she was doing. Clara kept wiping. "I'm not surprised." "He sat in the back booth both times. Didn't say anything particular, but he watched the room." Martha set down a salt shaker. "I want you to know I told him the first table by the door was the only one available the second time." Clara looked up at that. Martha met her eyes briefly, then went back to the salt shakers. "I run a fair establishment," she said. "That's all." It was the closest thing to a declaration of allegiance Clara had received from anyone in Red Hollow, other than Henry Cole, who had fixed the gap in her window frame without being asked, and charged her $3 less than the agreed-upon room rate the first week, because, as he put it, the room had been sitting empty and he hadn't needed to clean it before she moved in, so that part was on him. Small kindnesses. Clara had learned to recognize their weight. Cole Maverick came into Martha's cafe on the 8th morning. He came in with another man, a stocky rancher named Bert Hadley, who talked enough for both of them, and they took a table near the window, and Bert ordered eggs and biscuits, and proceeded to discuss the cost of winter feed for the next 10 minutes, while Cole sat across from him and drank his coffee and listened with the patience of someone who had either heard this particular speech before or had simply learned not to rush the people around him. Clara brought the food out and set it down and said the usual things and moved on, because that was the job, and because she was not going to be the kind of woman who stood around waiting for a man to acknowledge her just because he'd said a kind word on a train platform 9 days ago. She was almost back to the counter when Cole said, without raising his voice enough to be ostentatious about it, "Morning, Miss Whitmore." "Morning," she said, and didn't stop walking. She heard Bert Hadley say something under his breath and Cole reply something she couldn't catch. And then Bert laughed in the way people laughed when they'd just been mildly corrected. She went on with her work. He came back the following Tuesday, without Bert this time, and earlier, before the main rush, and he sat at the counter instead of a table, which meant he was in her section directly, which she suspected was not accidental. "You're still here," he said. Not as a question exactly. "Still here," she agreed and poured his coffee. "How are you finding it?" "The work's honest," she said. "The room's cold, but the window's fixed. The people are about what you'd expect from a town this size, half decent, half watching to see which way things go." He turned his coffee cup once on the counter, a slow, deliberate movement that she was starting to recognize as something he did when he was thinking. "Which half have you got more of so far?" "Jury's still out on some of them," Clara said. The corner of his mouth moved the same way it had on the platform, that not-quite smile. "That's a fair assessment of Red Hollow." She went to take an order from a man who'd just come in, and by the time she came back, Cole had his coffee half drunk and was looking out the window with the particular expression of someone who has something they're considering saying and hasn't decided yet. "There's no school in Red Hollow," he said when she passed him again. "I noticed," Clara said. "Hasn't been one for 2 years. The last teacher left when her husband's job took them south." He paused. "The children are getting whatever education their parents can manage, which for most of the ranch families isn't much." Clara stopped moving. She set down the cloth she'd been using to wipe the counter and looked at him directly. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Martha told me you spent 7 years teaching," he said. "And because I think you know what I'm about to suggest, and I want to see if you're going to tell me it's none of my business before or after I say it." Clara considered that for a moment. "Go ahead and say it." "The town council meets the first Monday of every month. Lester Price runs it. He owns the mill and thinks that's sufficient qualification to run everything else. There's been talk of bringing a teacher in, but nothing's come of it because nobody's pushed it, and Lester doesn't push things unless he sees an angle." Cole looked at her steadily. "I think if someone brought it to the council properly, with a clear case for why it was needed and who could fill the position, it would get approved." "Someone like you," Clara said. "Someone like us," he said. "You'd need to make the case for yourself. I can get the meeting." She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't look away, but he also didn't push. There was no urgency in his posture, no pressure, as though he'd simply laid something on the table and was prepared to wait while she decided what to do with it. "What's your interest in this?" she asked. He thought about that genuinely, which she appreciated. He didn't immediately produce a polished answer. "I have a neighbor family," he said finally. "The Henrys. 3 kids, oldest is 11. The boy, Will. He's sharp as anything, reads everything he can get his hands on. His father is a good man, but he never went past 5th grade. His mother is doing her best, but there's a lot of children and a lot of work and not enough hours." He paused. "Seems like a waste. Smart kid with nowhere to put it." Clara was quiet for a moment. "There are a lot of those," she said. "I know it," he said. She picked up the coffee pot and refilled his cup, even though he hadn't asked for more, because she needed something to do with her hands while she thought. "Nathan Caldwell," she said carefully. "He has influence with the council?" Cole's expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but enough. "Some. He doesn't sit on it, but he talks to the men who do." "Why?" "Because if you bring my name to that council," she said, "he's going to say things. And some of them might carry weight with the kind of men who decide based on how things look." "Probably," Cole said. He didn't dress it up or tell her she was wrong to think it. That's the straight answer. "I'm not afraid of him," Clara said. And she meant it, which was a different thing from not being aware of what he could do. "I just want to know what I'm walking into." "You'd be walking into a room with 7 men," Cole said, "who are mostly practical, mostly fair, and mostly just waiting for someone to give them a clear reason to do the right thing." He picked up his coffee. "That's what councils are. People who need a push." She thought about Will Henry and his father who'd never gone past 5th grade, and his mother with too many children and not enough hours. She thought about the 7 years she'd spent teaching in Ohio before a school board had decided her face was bad for the institution's image, and the way it had felt to lose that. Not just the job, but the thing the job gave her back every single day, which was the certainty that she was useful in a way that mattered. "The first Monday of next month," she said. "November 4th, Cole said. "I'll want to know everything about how the council works before then," she said. "Who responds to what? Who Lester Price listens to? What the objections will be so I can address them before they get raised. Cole nodded slowly. I can tell you what I know. Some of it I'll need to find out. Then find it out, Clara said. He drank his coffee and put 2 coins on the counter and stood up and said, I'll come back Thursday, same time. I'll be here, she said. He left without ceremony, and Clara watched him go for just a moment before turning back to the counter, and she noticed that the watching was not the same kind of watching she'd been doing all her life, the bracing, preemptive measuring of how someone was about to respond to her face. It was something else, something she didn't have a clean word for yet. She wiped the counter and went on with the morning. Over the next 2.5 weeks, Cole came in on Tuesday and Thursday mornings before the main rush, and sat at the counter with his coffee and told her what she needed to know. He did it plainly and without editorializing beyond what was useful, and she asked the kind of questions that demonstrated she was actually thinking about what he was saying rather than just collecting information to be polite about. Lester Price, Cole told her, responded to numbers. He wanted to know what a thing cost and what it returned. The education argument needed to be framed in practical terms. What better educated children meant for a town's future, what the lack of a school was already costing in terms of families choosing not to settle in Red Hollow when they might have otherwise. Bill Macer, who owned the hardware store and had 2 daughters under 10, would be sympathetic on principle but would follow Lester's lead unless given a reason not to. Jim Toller, the land agent, was unpredictable and somewhat suspicious of anything that hadn't already proven itself elsewhere. He'd want to know if other frontier towns had done this successfully. Arthur Denning, the town doctor, was the clearest thinker on the council and the least likely to be swayed by Nathan Caldwell's money. And if Clara could get Denning on her side early, the others would have to work harder to dismiss her. Clara wrote it all down in her composition notebook in the evenings, sitting at the small table in her room above the livery stable, with a candle she'd bought from Bill Macer's hardware store. She wrote down names and tendencies and the questions she'd need to answer. She thought about her lesson plans. She already had them, had been refining them mentally since the moment Cole had first mentioned Will Henry, and she added notes in the margins about how to present them to men who'd never thought much about what happened in a classroom. She also, during those 3 weeks, paid attention to Red Hollow in a way she hadn't allowed herself to do when she'd first arrived, when she'd been too stunned and too focused on basic survival to do much more than function from 1 hour to the next. The town was harder than it looked from the train platform, but also more complicated. There were people here who had come from somewhere else, like her, who'd arrived with something they were running from or running toward and had stayed because leaving was harder than they'd expected or because they'd found something worth staying for. There were families who'd been here long enough that Red Hollow was simply the world, unremarkable, simply home. There were people who were lonely in the particular way that frontier isolation created loneliness, not dramatic or literary about it, just quietly worn down by too much space and not enough of the things that made space bearable. The children, when she started to see them clearly, were everywhere. 8 or 9 of them she could count in town on any given morning. She didn't know yet how many lived on the outlying ranches, but Cole estimated another dozen at minimum. She started carrying chalk in her apron pocket, which was not something she'd planned or thought about. She'd simply found herself doing it one morning and understood that some part of her had made a decision before the rest of her caught up. On a Thursday in late October, about a week before the council meeting, Nathan Caldwell came into Martha's cafe for the first time since Martha had redirected him to the front table. Clara heard the door and knew before she turned around, the way you sometimes know things, a shift in the room's quality, in the particular way the other customer's conversation fractured and resumed. She finished what she was doing, which was refilling coffee for Arthur Denning, who was reading the week-old newspaper from Billings, and then she turned. Nathan was standing near the entrance looking at the room. He was dressed better than the working ranchers who came in, pressed shirt, clean jacket, the kind of presentation that said a man had someone to do his laundry. He saw her almost immediately, and something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read from across the room. He sat down at a table in her section. Clara went to the counter, poured a coffee, and brought it to him. She set it down without spilling it, which she was mildly proud of. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "is there anything else I can get you?" He looked up at her. "I heard you're planning to go to the town council about the school." "That's right," she said. His jaw tightened slightly. "I want you to know that I have friends on that council, men who listen to me." Clara looked at him steadily. She had thought about what she would say if this moment came. She had run through several versions of it in her room at night. What came out was simpler than any of them. "Then they're lucky men," she said. "I hope they also have the sense to make up their own minds." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, that she hadn't apologized or backed down or looked away. "You don't belong here," he said, quietly enough that no one else could hear. "I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it as a plain fact." "You said something similar at the train station," Clara said, "and I'm still here." She picked up her cloth. "Will you be ordering food or just the coffee?" He stared at her for a moment. Then he looked down at his cup. "Just the coffee," he said. She went back to the counter. Her hands were not shaking, which surprised her slightly, and she stood at the counter for a moment just taking stock of that. Arthur Denning looked up from his newspaper and caught her eye and gave her a small nod. So small it could have meant anything, but she chose to read it the way it seemed intended. She went back to work. Cole came in that same Thursday, later than usual, and he could tell from looking at her that something had happened. He didn't ask immediately. He ordered his coffee and waited until the room thinned out, and then he said, "You all right?" "Nathan came in," she said. Cole's face didn't change much, but his hand stopped moving on the counter. "What did he say?" "That he has friends on the council, that I don't belong here." She paused. "The usual." "What did you say?" "I asked if he wanted food or just coffee." Cole looked at her for a moment, and this time what moved at the corner of his mouth was something more than the almost smile. It was actual. Brief, and then gone. But real. "He's worried," Cole said. "Men like Nathan only bother with people they're not worried about if they think it'll cost them something. The fact that he came in here and said that to your face means he's heard enough to think you're an actual threat." "I'm a woman who works in a cafe," Clara said. "You're a woman who works in a cafe and is going to stand up in front of the town council in 6 days, Cole said. "In a town where the last time most people saw you, you were standing on a platform in front of everybody while he did what he did. They haven't forgotten it. Some of them are still chewing on it." Clara thought about Martha and her front table, about Henry Cole fixing the window without being asked, about Arthur Denning's small nod. "What are they chewing on exactly?" she asked. Cole considered his words. "Nathan Caldwell has money and land, and he's been here long enough that people are used to following his lead. But he doesn't have—" He stopped. "He doesn't have the thing that makes people actually like you. He has the thing that makes people compliant. There's a difference, and most people know it even if they don't say it out loud." "And what is it that makes people actually like you?" Clara asked, not entirely rhetorically. "Damned if I know," Cole said. "I'm not much liked myself." "You're liked well enough," Clara said. He looked at her sideways. "How would you know?" "Because when Bert Hadley talks about you, he talks like he's talking about a man he trusts," she said. "And Martha makes your coffee before you ask, which she doesn't do for most people. And Henry told me that the reason Will Henry's father still has his north pasture is because you co-signed his note at the bank 3 years ago when he was short." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Henry shouldn't have told you that." "Henry told me because he wanted me to know what kind of man you were," Clara said. "And so do I know." He looked at his coffee cup. He had the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being talked about accurately and wasn't entirely sure how to respond to it. "The council meeting," he said finally. "I'm ready," Clara said. "Tell me what you're planning to say." She told him. She laid it out. The numbers, the practical argument, the lesson structure, the names of frontier towns where similar initiatives had worked. And she watched his face as she did, checking for the things that landed and the things that didn't. He stopped her twice. Once to say that the point about property values was one Lester Price would respond to strongly, and she should lead with it rather than bury it. Once to say that the story about the families who left, there were 2 she'd heard about from Martha who'd settled west of Red Hollow and moved on because they wanted schooling for their children, should be saved for the end, because ending on a concrete loss would stay in the room after she left. Clara made notes. Cole watched her make them. "You've done this before," he said. "Made a case in a room that didn't want to hear it." 7 years of school board meetings," she said. "And they still pushed you out." "Yes," she said, "but you got things done in those 7 years." "I got things done," she said. "The children who went through that school are somewhere reading because of those years, and they'll teach their own children. Nathan Caldwell telling me I don't belong doesn't erase that." Cole looked at her across the counter, and she held his gaze because she wasn't going to look away from it, and what was in his expression was something she still wasn't sure she could name. But it had moved past assessment and past whatever initial curiosity had brought him to the platform that first morning. It was something more considered than that. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't." He left his coffee money and stood up and put his hat on. At the door he turned and said, "I'll pick you up at the livery stable at 7:30 the morning of the 4th. The meeting's at 8. "I'll be ready," she said. He nodded and left, and Clara went to clear his cup, and she stood at the counter for a moment holding it and listening to the ordinary sounds of the cafe and the street outside. And she let herself feel, just briefly, what it was like to be in a town she'd been thrown away in and to have, nonetheless, something worth showing up for. She'd had that feeling before, at the start of each school year, when the desks were still clean and the chalk was new and the children were loud and uncertain and full of things they didn't know yet. She'd missed it more than she'd admitted to herself. She rinsed Cole's cup and hung it and went to check on the tables. And from the window above the sink, she could see the length of Red Hollow's main street in the thin morning light. The mill at one end, the church at the other, the line of storefronts in between. And she thought, if she taught here, her students would walk this street their whole lives, would know things about it that their parents hadn't known, would make decisions with more understanding of how things worked and why, and what they could be changed into. Nathan Caldwell was going to say things at that council meeting. She knew that as clearly as she knew anything, but Nathan Caldwell had already done his worst to her, publicly, in front of witnesses, 3 weeks ago on that platform. And she was still here. She turned from the window and picked up the coffee pot and went back to the room, and the morning opened out in front of her the way mornings did, ordinary and demanding and full of the next thing that needed doing. And Clara Whitmore went to meet it. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew as November 4th drew closer and the council meeting approached and Nathan Caldwell made his quiet rounds of the men he knew, was that the question the town of Red Hollow was about to be asked was not really about a school at all. It was the older question that towns always eventually had to answer. What kind of place are we going to be, and who gets to decide that? The answer was coming, and it was going to cost someone something. It always did. The morning of November 4th came in cold and clear, the kind of Montana morning that had no patience for hesitation. Clara was awake before 5. She had slept poorly. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular restlessness that came when a thing she'd been preparing for was finally close enough to touch. She lay in the narrow bed listening to the horses below and going through what she planned to say, testing each part of it the way you test ice before you put your weight on it. She dressed carefully. The good dark dress, the one she'd packed in Ohio when she still thought she was dressing for a different kind of arrival. She'd pressed it 2 days ago with the iron she'd borrowed from Martha and hung it so it wouldn't fold again overnight. She put her hair up plainly and neatly because she wasn't going into that room as something decorative, and she didn't want to pretend otherwise. She put her composition notebook in her bag along with the 2 pages of notes she'd distilled from weeks of preparation. She did not look in the small square of mirror above the wash basin longer than she needed to. She knew what was there. She'd made her peace with it a long time ago, or at least a working peace, the kind that held on most days. Cole was at the livery stable at 7:30 as he'd said he'd be. He had his horse, and he'd brought a second one for her, a calm bay mare that stood without pulling at the hitching post. He looked at her when she came down the stairs, and he didn't say anything about how she looked or offer any of the encouraging remarks that people sometimes offered before difficult things, which she was grateful for because she didn't need encouraging. She needed to get there. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They rode the short distance to the mill where the council met, and she was aware, as they went, of the people on the street who watched them pass. Red Hollow was a small enough place that 2 people riding together at 7:30 on a Monday morning was a thing people noticed, and who those 2 people were was a thing they noticed more. She didn't look back at any of them. The council room was in the back of Lester Price's mill building, a practical arrangement that Lester had engineered because he liked the idea of the town's decision-making happening in a place that was his. It smelled like sawdust and lamp oil, and the stale particular smell of a room used for meetings more than anything else. There was a long table with 7 chairs on one side and a single chair on the other, and Clara understood immediately that the single chair was for her. She sat down in it. The 7 council members filed in over the next 10 minutes. Lester Price first, a blocky man in his 60s with a mill owner's permanently suspicious expression. Bill Macer behind him, nodding at Clara with the careful friendliness of a man who hadn't yet decided anything. Jim Toller, the land agent, who looked at her with the sideways assessment she'd half expected. Arthur Denning, who came in last, settled into his chair at the far end and opened a small notebook of his own without looking at anyone in particular. 3 other men she knew less well: Ed Sutter, who ran the feed store, Pat Cullen, the postmaster, and Ray Birch, who owned the livery stable on the south side and was not Henry Cole and had none of Henry's easy decency, from what she'd observed. Cole did not sit at the table. He stood to the side of the room, against the wall, which was technically not a council position, but no one told him to leave. Nathan Caldwell was not in the room. That surprised her enough that she glanced toward the door once, then stopped herself because she was not going to spend her time in this room wondering about Nathan Caldwell. Lester Price cleared his throat and opened the meeting with the brisk efficiency of a man who believed that time spent in meetings was time taken from the mill. "We've received a petition," he said, "requesting the council consider establishing a school and filling the teaching position. Miss Clara Whitmore has asked to address the council on the matter." He looked at Clara over his glasses. "You've got 20 minutes, Miss Whitmore. We'll hear you out and then deliberate." "Thank you," Clara said. She opened her notebook. She did not look at Cole against the wall. She did not look at the door. "The town of Red Hollow currently has no school," she said. "By my count, there are 19 children between the ages of 5 and 14 living within 4 miles of this building. 11 of them have had no formal education whatsoever. The remaining 8 are receiving what their parents can provide, which in most cases amounts to basic reading and simple arithmetic, delivered when the farm work allows it." She looked up from her notebook. She made eye contact with Lester Price first because he was the one she needed. "3 families in the past 2 years have chosen not to settle in Red Hollow," she said. "I spoke with Martha Bell, who knew 2 of them personally. Both families had children of school age. Both gave the lack of a school as a primary reason for moving on. In both cases, those families went south to towns with established schools, and they are still there. Those families represent 2 households, 2 sets of income spending in local businesses, and 2 future generations who grew up somewhere that was not Red Hollow." Lester's expression had shifted slightly. Not to agreement. Lester Price was not the kind of man who shifted to agreement quickly, but to the particular attention of someone who had just heard a number that meant something to him. "What are you proposing exactly?" he said. "A 1-room school," Clara said. "I've identified a suitable location, the old Wren building at the east end of the main street, which has been vacant for 14 months. With minimal repairs, it's adequate for 20 students. I'm proposing a curriculum appropriate for mixed ages, primary reading and arithmetic for the youngest, more advanced writing, history, and natural science for the older students. 6 hours of instruction per day, 5 days a week." "Who pays for the repairs?" Ray Birch asked. "I've spoken to 3 families who have children of school age," Clara said. "All 3 have offered labor. Henry Cole has offered the lumber at cost. The total material expense is approximately $40. "And your salary?" Lester said. $12 a month, Clara said, "which I understand is below the regional average for a teaching position, but reflects the current limitations of the town's budget. I'm prepared to accept that rate for the first year with the expectation that the rate would be reviewed at the year's end based on enrollment and outcomes." Bill Macer leaned forward slightly. "You have experience?" 7 years, Clara said. "In Harmon County, Ohio. I taught children from age 5 through 14, reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and basic natural science. My students consistently tested at or above county standards." "Why did you leave?" Jim Toller asked. There it was. She had expected it, and she had her answer ready, and she was going to give it plainly. "The school board decided my appearance was unsuitable for the position," she said. "They were wrong, but they had the authority to make the decision, and I couldn't stop them from making it." The room was quiet for a moment. "Your appearance," Jim Toller said carefully. "My scars," Clara said. "The scars on my face, which I've had since I was 19 and which I received while pulling my younger brother out of a burning house." She let that sit for exactly 1 second, then went on. "I'm not telling you that to make an emotional argument. I'm telling you so that if any member of this council has a concern about it, you can raise it now and I can address it rather than having it raised after I've left the room." No one said anything. Arthur Denning, at the end of the table, looked up from his notebook, and Clara felt him looking at her with the particular sharpness of a man who spent his professional life assessing people and was making an assessment now. "What outcomes would you consider evidence of success at the end of the first year?" Denning asked. Clara had prepared for this question too. Every enrolled child reading at or above grade level, 80% attendance, at least 2 families who were not currently sending children to school, doing so by the spring. Denning wrote something down. Lester Price opened his mouth to say something, and the door at the back of the room opened. Nathan Caldwell walked in. I was not dressed as he'd been in Martha's cafe. Dressed better, more formally, with the deliberate presentation of a man who wanted the room to feel his importance when he entered it. He had 2 men behind him, Caldwell hands. Clara knew one of them by sight from the street. He stopped just inside the door and looked at the council table and then at Clara. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, in a tone that did not sound apologetic. "I was told this was an open meeting." "It is," Lester said, with the slight wariness of a man who had been navigating between 2 forces and had hoped to get through today without having to choose. "Then I'd like to say a few words before the council votes," Nathan said. He moved to stand near the wall on the opposite side of the room from Cole, and Clara thought, briefly and without drama, that the geometry of it was interesting. The 2 of them on opposite walls with her in the chair between them. "The position of town teacher is an important one," Nathan said, addressing the council with the practiced ease of a man who was used to being heard in rooms. "It shapes children. It shapes what a community values. I respect the fact that Miss Whitmore has 7 years of experience." He paused just long enough to let the word but be understood before he said it. "But I have concerns about whether she is the right fit for this particular community." "What concerns?" Denning said. Nathan looked at the doctor briefly, recalibrated. "She arrived in Red Hollow in circumstances that were complicated. The circumstances of her arrival are known to most people here. I don't think it serves anyone to relitigate them, but I do think the council should consider whether appointing someone to a position of influence over children, someone whose own situation here is unresolved and uncertain." "What's unresolved about it?" Cole said. His voice came from the wall and it was quiet, which was worse for Nathan than if it had been loud, because quiet voices in a room like this made people listen harder. Nathan turned to look at him. "I didn't realize you were participating in this meeting, Maverick." "You said it was open," Cole said. "I'm standing in it." A beat passed. "What's unresolved?" Cole said again. "She has no permanent address in this town," Nathan said. "She has no property. She has no established—" "She has a job," Cole said. "She has a room. She's been here 6 weeks and she hasn't left, which is more than some people expected." He let that settle. "The only thing that's unresolved about her situation is whether this town is going to do the right thing with someone who's clearly qualified to do a job that clearly needs doing." "Cole," Clara said. He looked at her. "I'll speak for myself," she said. He nodded and closed his mouth, and she turned back to the council. "I want to address what Mr. Caldwell is actually saying," she said, "because I think everyone in this room knows what he's actually saying, and I think it's more productive to say it plainly than to talk around it." She looked at Nathan directly. "You are suggesting that because of my scars and because of the public way I was rejected when I arrived in this town, I'm not suitable to be in a position where people look up to me." Nathan said nothing. His jaw was tight. "I disagree," Clara said, and turned back to the council. "I think children seeing a person who has been visibly hurt, physically, publicly, and who stood back up and kept going and did her work anyway, I think that might be exactly the kind of thing children benefit from seeing. Not because I want to make a lesson of myself, but because none of those children are going to get through their lives without being hurt. And the question of what you do after is one that nobody teaches them." The room was very quiet. Lester Price was looking at his hands. Bill Macer was looking at Clara. Jim Toller was looking at somewhere just above the table. Arthur Denning had put his pen down. "I'm not asking for your sympathy," Clara said. "I'm asking for the job. I'm qualified for it. The town needs it. The numbers I've given you are accurate and verifiable. That's my case." She closed her notebook. Lester cleared his throat. "I think we'll ask non-council members to wait outside while we deliberate." Clara stood and took her bag and walked to the door. She heard Cole behind her. She heard Nathan Caldwell say something to Lester in a low voice, but she didn't slow down to catch what it was. Outside the mill building, the morning had gotten sharper. The cold came off the street with the kind of clarity that made everything look precise. The storefronts, the bare trees at the edge of town, the line of mountains in the distance. Cole stood beside her and didn't say anything for a moment. "You told me you'd speak for yourself," he said finally. "And I did," she said. "I should have waited." "Yes," she said, "but it was—" She stopped. "It helped," she said. "Knowing someone was going to say something if I didn't. It made it easier to choose to say it myself." He thought about that. "That might be the strangest compliment I've ever received." "I'm not sure it was a compliment," she said, "but it was true." They stood on the street in the cold. Down the block, she could see Martha Bell standing in the doorway of the cafe, watching them from a distance. Clara lifted her hand briefly, and Martha lifted hers in return. Nathan Caldwell came out of the mill building about 5 minutes later with his 2 men. He walked past Clara without speaking, and she watched him go, and she thought about the 8 months of letters, all that careful, considered writing about character and what mattered in a person, and she felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but shared a border with both of them. He reached his horse and mounted without looking back. Cole watched him go too. "He's going to be a problem," Clara said. "After this. Whatever happens in there." "He already is a problem," Cole said. "That's not new." "I mean a larger one," she said. Cole looked at her, and she could see that he understood what she meant, that this wasn't going to end at the council meeting, that Nathan Caldwell was not the kind of man who absorbed a loss and redirected his energy. He was the kind of man who responded to losing an argument by changing the argument. "I know," Cole said. The mill door opened and Lester Price appeared. He looked out at them with the expression of a man who had just concluded a conversation that was longer and more complicated than he'd wanted it to be. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She walked back toward him. "The council has voted," he said, 4-3 in favor of establishing the school and appointing you as teacher. You'll start the first Monday of December. We'll have the Wren building assessed this week and repairs started by end of month." Clara stood with that for a moment. 4-3. She had not assumed it would be unanimous. But she heard the 3 as clearly as the 4, and she wanted to know who they were, and she could guess. Jim Toller, Ray Birch, and one other. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Lester said. "Denning made the arithmetic argument. I just listened to it." He went back inside. Clara turned around. Cole was still at the street's edge, and she walked back toward him, and he looked at her face for the answer, and she said, 4-3. Something shifted in his expression. Relief quickly moved through. "Which way?" "In favor." He nodded slowly, twice. The way he nodded when he was processing something he genuinely wanted and had not been completely certain of getting. "Good," he said. That was all. They stood there a moment longer, and then he said, "Martha will want to hear." And Clara said, "Yes." And they walked up the street together toward the cafe, and it was ordinary enough from the outside, 2 people walking on a cold Montana morning, but Clara was aware of carrying something she hadn't carried into that meeting room. Not quite pride. Something quieter and more durable than pride. Martha had coffee ready before they got through the door, and she listened to the 4-3 with her arms crossed and her face doing something complicated that resolved, after a moment, into satisfaction. "Denning was yours," she said to Clara. "He was reasonable," Clara said. "Same thing," Martha said. Over the next 3 days, the Wren building was assessed and found to need less work than expected. A new stove, some window repair, and a thorough cleaning that Clara and 2 of the ranch mothers accomplished in one long Saturday that left all 3 of them with sore backs and dirty hands, and a room that smelled like lye soap and wood shavings and was entirely usable. Henry brought lumber for the 3 new desks that Ed Sutter's oldest son built in his spare evenings, rough but solid. Bill Macer donated a crate of chalk and a small crate of slates without being asked, which was the kind of thing that told you what a man's private opinion was, regardless of how he voted. Clara spent her evenings in the 2 weeks before the school opened, writing lesson plans by candlelight and thinking about the 11 children who had no formal education yet, and what the gap of that meant and how much of it could be closed and how fast. She was also thinking about Nathan Caldwell, not in the circular, anxious way she might have thought about him a year ago. In the practical, watchful way she'd learned to think about problems that weren't solved yet. Because what she'd said to Cole outside the mill was true. Nathan Caldwell was not finished. Men like him didn't end their campaigns at the point where they'd lost one vote. They changed their field. What his next field might be, she didn't know yet. But she was paying attention. It was Cole who first heard about the railroad. He came into Martha's on a Tuesday morning in mid-November, 8 days before the school was set to open, and he didn't sit at the counter. He stood, which he never did, and he waited until Clara was between tables, and then he said quietly, "I need to talk to you." She recognized the register of it. Not alarmed. Cole didn't do alarmed, but serious in a way that had a particular specific weight to it. "When do you open?" he said, meaning the cafe. "Another 2 hours," Martha said from the kitchen, which meant she was listening, which they both knew and neither of them minded. "You have time," Cole said to Clara. She took off her apron and they sat at the back table and he told her. There was a railroad company, a regional line trying to extend through the valley, and they'd been in preliminary discussions with landowners for the better part of a year. Quiet discussions that most people in Red Hollow hadn't known about because the company had specifically asked their negotiating partner in the valley to keep it quiet while they secured what they needed. Their negotiating partner in the valley was Nathan Caldwell. Cole had found out from Bert Hadley, who had heard it from a man who worked at the land office in Billings and owed Bert a favor. The railroad wanted a corridor through the valley that required acquiring land from 7 separate owners. 3 of them had already signed papers, small operations, isolated, who'd taken the offer because it was money and they'd needed it. The remaining 4 included Cole's North Pasture, the Henry family's East Field, a parcel owned by Ed Sutter that he didn't currently use but held the water rights to, and a strip of public land adjacent to the Wren building. The strip adjacent to the Wren building. Clara sat with that for a moment. "The school," she said. "The Wren building isn't on that strip," Cole said. "But if the railroad goes through that corridor, the building will be within about 50 feet of an active rail line. You won't be able to run a school there." "Is that what he's aiming for?" Clara said. I don't know if it's what he's aiming for or just what happens to be convenient," Cole said. "I don't know if Nathan planned any of this with the school in mind, but I know he knows about it, and he hasn't told anyone." Martha came to the table with 2 coffees and set them down and stood there. Clara looked up at her. "I heard," Martha said. "I'm not going anywhere." Clara looked at Cole. "How certain is Bert's source?" "Certain enough that Bert came to me at 7 in the morning," Cole said. "Bert doesn't come to anyone at 7 in the morning." Clara thought about the land agent, Jim Toller, who'd voted against her at the council meeting. Jim Toller, who would know about any land transactions that were formally recorded, who might or might not know about ones that hadn't been recorded yet. "Has anything been filed?" she said. "Not with the county office," Cole said. "Whatever's been signed so far has been signed privately. The formal filings would come later, once they have all the parcels. So right now," Clara said, "it exists as private agreements that are binding but not yet public record." "Yes," Cole said, "and once they file, once Nathan has all the parcels and the railroad company comes in officially, it's done," Clara said. "Everyone who signed privately has already agreed and the ones who didn't are surrounded." "That's how it works," Cole said. Martha sat down, which she almost never did at a table, and put her elbows on it. "Nathan Caldwell has been buying cooperation in this town for 20 years, she said. "He's never done anything openly wrong. He just arranges things." "He arranged the railroad quietly," Clara said. "He's going to benefit from it, probably significantly. The man who coordinates the corridor deal gets a cut," Cole said, "or an advantageous position. I don't know the exact terms, but there's always something." "And the 4 landowners who haven't signed yet," Clara said. "You, the Henrys, Ed Sutter." "And the county," Cole said. "What happens if you don't sign?" "Then the company can't complete the corridor," Cole said. "They'll move the route, but moving the route adds cost and time, and they'll put pressure on the holdouts. Price offers, legal arguments about public necessity, whatever they have." "Or Nathan will," Clara said. Cole looked at her steadily. "Yes." She drank her coffee and thought. There was a shape to this that she could see. Not every detail of it yet, but the overall shape, the way certain things were connected and where the pressure points were, and what happened if you pushed on each of them. "Do the Henrys know?" she said. "No," Cole said. I came to you first." She looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup on the table. the deliberate motion she'd come to know. "Because you think clearly when things are complicated," he said. "And because this is going to get complicated." It was, she thought, one of the more direct things he'd said to her. It landed with a weight she didn't fully examine right then, because there were more urgent things to think about. "The school opens in 8 days, she said. "Yes," Cole said. "Whatever we do about the railroad has to happen in a way that doesn't delay that," she said. "The children are expecting to start. The families have planned for it." "Agreed," Cole said. "Then here's what I think," Clara said, and she pulled her composition notebook out of her bag, because she thought better when she was writing, and she opened it to a fresh page. "We need to find out what was actually signed and what the terms are. We need to know what rights the 4 unsigned landowners have, and whether there's any legal protection for the public strip. We need to know whether what Nathan has done is improper or just strategic, because there's a difference and it matters." "Denning might know someone," Cole said. "The doctor in a town like this knows the lawyer in the next town." "Yes," Clara said. "Talk to Denning. Don't tell anyone else yet. Not because I want to keep secrets, but because the moment this becomes general knowledge, Nathan is going to know we know, and he'll accelerate whatever he's planning." Cole nodded. "And I'm going to keep opening the school," Clara said. "Whatever happens with the railroad, the school opens on the first Monday of December, and I will be there." Martha made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been something she was working through. "He's not going to like losing twice," Martha said. "No," Clara said. "He's not." She wrote 3 things in the notebook and underlined them. Bert's source. Denning. The county land records. Then she looked up at Cole across the table, and he was watching her with the same expression he'd had in that council room when she'd told him she would speak for herself. Something that had moved past simple regard into something more specific and more steady. "You knew about the school," she said. "The strip of land next to the Wren building. You knew that before you pushed the council for me." "I didn't know about the railroad then," he said. "I found out 2 days ago." "But you knew about the strip." He was quiet a moment. "I knew it was county land adjacent to the building. I didn't know it was part of anything Nathan had." She believed him. She'd gotten reasonably good at reading him over these weeks, and what she saw now was a man telling her the exact truth and not much else. "All right," she said. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name, and neither of them commented on it, because commenting on it would have made it into something other than what it was, which was simply a man saying a woman's name at the moment the formality had stopped fitting. "I'm going to be straight with you. Nathan has money and time and connections in this valley going back 20 years. What we have is—" He stopped. "What?" she said. "We have the truth," he said. "And we have the fact that a lot of people in this valley are tired of arrangements they didn't get to be part of." He looked at her steadily. "That's enough if we use it right." She looked back at him and thought that he was probably right, and also that probably was doing real work in that sentence, and that she was tired enough of losing to be willing to fight on worse odds than these. "Then let's use it right," she said. Outside, Red Hollow went about its morning. The cold had settled in deeper over the past week, and the bare trees at the edge of town were fixed and stark against the sky, and the mountains in the distance had new snow on them that caught the light and made them look both closer and more unreachable than usual. Clara closed her notebook and picked up her coffee and drank the last of it, and she thought about 19 children and 11 of them with no schooling, and the Wren building with its new stove and its rough-made desks, and the smell of lye soap and wood shavings that was still clinging faintly to her hands from the Saturday cleaning. 8 days. Whatever Nathan Caldwell was planning, she had 8 days, and she intended to use every one of them. Arthur Denning did know a lawyer. His name was Frank Aldis, and he practiced in Clearwater, 12 miles east, and Denning had known him for 11 years through a shared interest in the kind of careful, unglamorous legal work that kept small communities from being quietly dismantled by the people with the most money in them. Denning sent a letter by the Tuesday post and had a reply by Thursday, which was fast enough that Clara understood Denning had written with some urgency and Aldis had responded in kind. The reply said 3 things that mattered. First, that private land agreements were binding in Montana territory, regardless of whether they'd been formally recorded with the county, which meant the 3 landowners who'd already signed with Nathan were committed whether they understood the full implications or not. Second, that the public strip adjacent to the Wren building was classified as town common land, which required a full council vote to transfer or encumber. It could not be dealt away privately by any individual, without the council's approval. Third, that if a railroad corridor was being planned through private land in the valley, there should be a preliminary survey on file with the Territorial Land Office in Helena, and that survey was public record. Clara read the letter twice at the back table of Martha's cafe on a Thursday evening after closing, with Martha refilling her tea and Cole sitting across from her reading his own copy that Denning had brought over. "The survey," Clara said. "Yes," Cole said. "If the survey is filed, it shows the exact corridor," she said. "It shows which parcels are included and what the company's intentions are." "And it's public," Cole said, "which means Nathan can't pretend the railroad doesn't exist once we have it," she said. "He can't say it's rumor. He can't say Bert's source got it wrong." "Aldous says he can have someone pull the filing in Helena by end of next week," Cole said. Clara thought about that. The school opened in 5 days. She would be standing in front of children on Monday morning, regardless of what was happening with the railroad, and she was not going to let the railroad consume the space that the school needed from her right now. But she also could not afford to let Nathan get further ahead of them than he already was. "Tell Denning to have Aldous pull the survey," she said, "and in the meantime we talk to the Henrys." Cole nodded. "I'll ride out tomorrow." "I'll come with you," Clara said. He looked at her. "You're working tomorrow." "I'm working until 10, she said. "Martha, can you manage from 10 onward on Friday?" Martha looked at her from behind the counter with the expression of a woman who had managed considerably more difficult things than a Friday morning without one extra pair of hands. "Go," she said. They rode out to the Henry place the following morning in cold that had gotten serious overnight, the kind that made the horse's breath come in steady white puffs and settled into the joints, and reminded a person that Montana winter was not a metaphor. The Henry land was 4 miles northwest of town, a working ranch of modest size that looked like what it was. A family operation run on calculation and physical effort with not much margin for error. The house was plain and practical. The barn needed paint. The fence along the east pasture, the one Clara now understood was part of the railroad corridor, was solid and well-maintained, which told you where Tom Henry put his limited repair budget. Tom Henry was a big man, not tall but broad, with hands that looked like they'd been shaped by 30 years of fence work, and the kind of face that didn't give much away until it did. His wife, Ruth, was slender and quick, and had the particular competence of a woman who had learned to run a household and a farm simultaneously without anyone noticing how much of the work was hers. The oldest boy, Will, the one Cole had mentioned in Martha's cafe weeks ago, the one who read everything he could find, was 11 and standing in the yard when they rode in, and he looked at Clara with the focused, slightly startled attention of a child who has heard that a teacher is coming to Red Hollow and is now processing that the teacher is a real person. "Will," Cole said, "go tell your father we're here." Will went, and Cole and Clara dismounted, and Ruth came to the door and invited them in, and within 10 minutes they were at the kitchen table with coffee, and Tom Henry had come in from the barn with mud on his boots, and the wariness of a man who'd learned that unexpected visits from neighbors often meant unexpected problems. Cole told him. He told him about the railroad, about the corridor, about the 3 landowners who'd already signed, about the public strip near the school, and about what Frank Aldous had said. He told it plainly and in order and without editorializing, and Tom Henry sat and listened with his big hands wrapped around his coffee cup and his face doing the thing it did where it didn't show much. When Cole finished, Tom was quiet for a moment. "How long has Nathan known?" he said. "At least a year," Cole said. "Probably longer." Tom looked at the table. He looked at his wife briefly, and she looked back at him, and there was a whole conversation in that exchange that Clara read as clearly as if it had been spoken, the particular marital shorthand of 2 people who had been solving problems together for long enough that they didn't need to do it out loud every time. "The east pasture," Tom said. "Yes," Cole said. "If the rail line goes through there—" Tom stopped. "That's where we run the cattle from March through July. The fence runs the length of it." "I know," Cole said. "What do we do?" Ruth said. She was asking both of them, but she was looking at Clara, which Clara noticed. "We find out exactly what the survey shows," Clara said. "We get the filing from Helena, and we see what the corridor actually encompasses and what it requires. Once we know that, we know what options are available." She looked at Tom. "But I want to be direct with you about something." Tom looked at her. The railroad may have legal tools available to it, she said. If the company decides to push the corridor through, they can make legal arguments about public necessity, about the territory's need for rail access, arguments that a court might entertain even if they're not entirely fair. I don't say that to alarm you. I say it because I think you should know what you might be facing. Tom was quiet a moment. So we might not be able to stop it. The goal isn't necessarily to stop the railroad, Clara said. The goal is to make sure that if it happens transparently, with fair compensation for everyone it affects, and without Nathan Caldwell pocketing the difference between what the company is willing to pay and what he tells you it's willing to pay. Tom's expression shifted then, just slightly, just enough for Clara to see that she'd landed on something specific. He came out here, Tom said, 6 weeks ago. Said a company was interested in a right-of-way through the valley. Said the offer was going to be modest because the land wasn't prime. Said I should consider it. What did you say? Cole said. Said I'd think about it, Tom said. Did he give you a number? Clara said. Said probably around $40 an acre for the right-of-way strip, Tom said. Cole looked at Clara. The survey will tell us what the company has offered the parcels that have already signed, she said, and Aldous can find out what the going rate is for rail right-of-way in comparable corridors. She looked at Tom. $40 an acre may be significantly below what this company is actually prepared to pay. Tom was quiet. Then he said a word that Clara would not have expected from a man who'd been as controlled as he had through this conversation, a short and pointed word that in other circumstances she might have remarked upon. Ruth gave him a look. Sorry, he said. Don't be, Clara said. Will was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, partially visible, listening with the focused attention of a child who understood that something important was being decided and who had the intelligence to follow more of it than the adults in the room likely thought. Will, Clara said. He didn't flinch at being caught. He came fully into the doorway and looked at her directly, which she respected. School opens Monday, she said. I expect you there. Something moved across his face that was trying very hard not to be what it was, which was the particular contained excitement of a kid who had been waiting for something so long that when it arrived, he didn't trust it enough to show how much he wanted it. Yes, ma'am, he said. She and Cole rode back toward town with the cold settling in deeper and the mountains throwing long shadows across the valley. They didn't talk much. There was enough to think about that silence was more useful than conversation. About a mile from town, Clara said, Ed Sutter. Tomorrow, Cole said. I'll go in the morning. I'll write Aldous directly tonight, she said. Denning can send it with the Morning Post. Cole nodded. And the council, she said. He looked at her. If the public strip requires a council vote to be transferred, she said, then as long as we have 4 votes on the council, Nathan cannot touch it. We have 4. We know we have 4 because 4 of them voted for the school. Lester, Cole said slowly. Lester voted for me, she said. Because Denning made the arithmetic argument and Lester understands arithmetic. If we can show Lester that Nathan's railroad arrangement costs the town more than it gains, or that there's an argument for the town to have its own negotiating position rather than letting Nathan negotiate on everyone's behalf. Lester doesn't like being cut out of things, Cole said. No, Clara said. I don't imagine he does. Cole was quiet for a moment and then said, You've thought about this a lot. I've been thinking about it since Tuesday morning, she said. I think while I'm doing other things. It's a habit. Must be tiring, he said. Sometimes, she said honestly, but this particular problem is the kind I don't mind thinking about, because it has a shape, and things with a shape can be handled. He looked at her sideways and she caught it, and neither of them said anything about it. The school opened on Monday. It was the first Monday of December, and the cold had made up its mind by then. Real winter cold, the sustained kind that meant business. And Clara was at the Wren building at 6:30 in the morning to get the stove going so the room would be warm enough by 8. She laid the fire herself and got it going on the second try, which she considered acceptable, and then she arranged the desks the way she'd decided on after 3 different arrangements that week, not in straight rows but in a slight arc, so that she could see every face from the front without anyone being hidden. 14 children came on the first day. She had expected 12, based on the families she'd spoken to. The extra 2 were a brother and sister, 8 and 6, whose family had moved to Red Hollow 2 weeks prior from a failed homestead further north, and whom Clara hadn't known about. They arrived with their mother, who stood in the doorway looking at Clara with the expression of a woman who had recently lost enough things that she was protective of anything good that remained. And Clara spoke to her briefly and quietly and told her the children were welcome and she'd assess where they were academically in the first week and adjust accordingly. Will Henry was there. He arrived early, before most of the others, and sat at the desk in the second row that Clara had privately already thought of as his, not because she played favorites, but because she'd been teaching long enough to know within the first hour which student was going to change the character of a classroom, and Will had that quality. The first day was not smooth. It was not supposed to be smooth. The youngest children didn't know how to sit still for sustained periods, which was normal and expected, and two of the middle children had such significant gaps in their reading that Clara revised her initial assessments within the first hour. One boy, Ray Birch's son, which was not something Clara had known, and which complicated her feelings briefly before she set them aside, because children were not their fathers, was actively resistant in the way that children were resistant when they were covering for being frightened. She spent 15 minutes with him before lunch on something he already knew how to do, which was basic counting, and she let him do it well in front of the group, and she watched the resistance loosen by about a third. She would take what she could get. Martha came by at midday with a covered pot of soup and left it without ceremony on the step, which was the kind of thing that did not require comment. By the end of the first day, Clara was exhausted in the way that first days with children always made her exhausted. Not depleted, but used up in the good way, the way she'd forgotten about in the years since Ohio. She locked the Wren building and walked back toward the livery stable and past three parents on the street who had clearly been watching for her. The first was Ruth Henry, who said simply, "Will came home and talked about the lesson for 45 minutes without stopping. He's never done that before." The second was a woman Clara knew slightly from the cafe, who said her daughter had asked at supper whether the next day was a school day, and when told yes had said good and gone back to eating, which the mother seemed to consider evidence of significant satisfaction. The third was Ray Birch, and that one was more complicated. He was standing near the livery, not obviously waiting, but too still to be just passing through, and when Clara came level with him, he said, "My son." "James?" Clara said. "Yes." "He doesn't do well with—" Birch stopped. He was a heavy-set man with the sort of face that had settled into disapproval over the years, the way a field settled into ruts. "He doesn't listen to women," he said. Not proudly, but not apologetically either. Just as information. "He listened today," Clara said. "Or he will, by the end of the week. He needs to believe he's capable of the work first." Birch looked at her with the expression of a man encountering an argument he hadn't prepared for. "He is capable," Clara said. "He's behind because he hasn't had instruction, not because anything is wrong with him. Give me a month." Birch said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "He voted against you at the council." "I know," Clara said. "You're still teaching his kid." "He's 7 years old," Clara said. "He didn't vote for anything." Birch's expression shifted. Something moved through it that she couldn't fully name. And then he nodded, once, and walked away. She was not going to call that a victory, but she was going to file it. The survey from Helena arrived by Thursday post. Aldous had moved quickly. Denning had explained the situation in his letter with enough specificity that the lawyer understood the time constraint. And the filing was a 20-page document that Clara and Cole and Denning spread across the back table at Martha's Cafe on a Thursday evening, and read through with the methodical attention of people who understood that they were looking for something specific, but weren't entirely sure what form it would take when they found it. It took them 40 minutes to find it. The survey described the corridor in detail, parcel numbers, acreage, the exact line of the proposed rail route. It named each property in the path. And on page 14, buried in the compensation schedule, it listed the per-acre right-of-way rate that the railroad company had established for the corridor. $92 an acre. Clara read it twice. Then she looked up at Cole, then at Denning. "He told Tom Henry 40, she said. "He told Tom Henry 40, Cole confirmed, and his voice was very quiet. Denning had his reading glasses on and was looking at the number with the expression of a man who had suspected something and had just had that suspicion confirmed with more specificity than he'd expected. "The difference between 40 and 92, he said, on the Henry parcel alone." He looked at the acreage figure. "The right-of-way strip through the east pasture is approximately 11 acres. At the actual rate, Tom Henry would receive just over $1,000. At the rate Nathan told him, 440, Clara said. More than $500 difference on one parcel, Denning said. And Nathan is the one coordinating all 4 unsigned parcels. Plus the 3 who already signed, Cole said. They were all quiet for a moment with the weight of that. This is fraud, Clara said. It's potentially fraud, Denning said, because he was precise about these things. We'd need Aldous to confirm that Nathan represented himself as the landowner's agent rather than the company's agent. If he was acting as the company's representative, the lower offer could be characterized as a negotiating position. If he told these landowners he was acting in their interest, he told Tom he was helping him understand the offer, Cole said. Those were the words Tom used, that Nathan was helping him understand it. Denning took off his glasses. He rubbed the bridge of his nose in the way he did when something had resolved into clarity he'd rather not have. Write that down exactly, he said to Clara. What Cole just said. Tom Henry's account of Nathan's words. Get it in writing from Tom directly. A signed statement. Clara was already writing. Ed Sutter? She said without looking up. I talked to Ed on Saturday, Cole said. Nathan told Ed the offer was $45 an acre. Ed has 12 acres in the corridor. That's a potential difference of over $560 on Ed's parcel alone. Martha, who had been pouring coffee and not saying anything for 20 minutes, set the pot down and said, That man. Yes, Clara said. How do we bring this to the council? Cole said. Carefully, Denning said, and with documentation. We need Tom's statement, Ed's statement, the survey filing itself, and Aldis's professional opinion on whether this constitutes fraudulent misrepresentation. Then we bring it to the council as a formal complaint, not as a rumor, not as an allegation, as a documented case. And the council, Clara said, will have to deal with it publicly. If we present it publicly, yes, Denning said. We present it publicly, Clara said. It was not a question. Cole looked at her. Nathan's entire approach has been to handle things privately, she said. The private letters to me, the private conversation with the council before my appointment, the private agreements with the landowners. He does things quietly because quiet is where his kind of influence works. She looked at Cole and then at Denning. We take this to the council in an open meeting. Anyone who wants to attend can attend. Full account of the survey, the actual rates, the amounts Tom and Ed were told versus the amounts the company is actually paying, and the question of who authorized Nathan to negotiate on behalf of these landowners. Denning put his glasses back on. It will be messy. Yes, Clara said. Nathan will deny it. He can deny it with the survey on the table in front of everyone, Clara said. Denning was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll write to Aldous tonight. Cole walked Clara back to the livery stable after, through the cold that had deepened after dark into something that made the stars look sharp and close. They didn't talk for the first block. There was too much still sitting in the room with them from the numbers on page 14, too much to process quickly. At the livery stable steps, Cole said, When this gets out, and it'll get out before the council meeting, some of it always does, Nathan is going to know it's us. He already knows it's us, Clara said. Cole looked at her. He's known since the council meeting that I wasn't going away, she said. He came into Martha's cafe and told me I didn't belong here, and I didn't leave. He tried to use the council, and it voted 4-3, and we're still standing. He knows. She paused. The question isn't whether he knows. The question is whether what we have is enough to put in front of people in a way they can't dismiss. I think it is, Cole said. So do I, she said. There was a silence that was different from the ones they usually left things in. Not comfortable exactly, but not uncomfortable either. Something with a weight to it that was more personal than the conversation they'd just been having. Clara, Cole said. She waited. When this is done, he stopped. He was not a man who abandoned sentences, so she knew he was editing, which was also something she'd come to know about him. I'd like to ask you something, he said, but not now. When this is done. She looked at him in the dark and the cold, and she thought about what she knew of this man. Not everything. She didn't know everything. She'd only known him 2 months. But what she knew was enough to understand that the something he wanted to ask was not small, and that he was not asking it now because he was the kind of person who understood that some things needed to be separated from the noise of urgent problems, who believed that certain conversations deserved to happen in clear air. "All right," she said, "when it's done." He nodded and said goodnight and walked back up the street, and Clara went up the stairs to her room and sat at the small table and did not open her notebook for once. She just sat with the evening, the survey numbers, the children's faces from Monday morning, Will Henry talking for 45 minutes without stopping, Cole's voice saying when this is done, and she let it all be there together without trying to organize it or plan around it or figure out what it meant. Some things didn't need figuring yet. The council meeting was scheduled for the third week of December. Aldous rode from Clearwater himself, which Denning had not asked him to do, but which the lawyer apparently decided was warranted once he'd reviewed the survey and the statements from Tom Henry and Ed Sutter, which had been collected in writing within the week. Tom Henry's statement was 4 pages. Ed Sutter's was 2. Both were precise about what Nathan had told them, when he'd told them, and what words he had used. The afternoon before the council meeting, Nathan Caldwell came to the Wren building. The children had gone home for the day. Clara was at the front of the room erasing the day's arithmetic from the slate board, and she heard the door open and turned, and Nathan was standing in the doorway looking at the room, at the rough-made desks, at the slates, at the maps she'd pinned to the wall, at the books stacked on the shelf Cole had built on a Saturday 2 weeks ago. He stood there for a moment without speaking. "School's closed for the day," Clara said. "I know," he said. "I came to see you." She set down the eraser but did not step back from the front of the room. "I know what you have," he said. "The survey. The statements." She waited. "I want you to understand something," he said. His voice was different from the other time she'd heard it. The studied ease was gone, or partially gone, and what was under it was something more human, which perversely made him more uncomfortable to look at, not less. "I have been in this valley for 20 years. I have built something here. The railroad is good for this town. It will bring commerce. It will bring people. It will make Red Hollow into something instead of a place the train used to pass by. What I negotiated is good for this valley, even if the margins weren't distributed the way you think they should be." "The margins," Clara said. "The difference between what I told the landowners and what the company is actually paying," he said. "I was acting as an agent. Agents take a fee. That's how it works." "An agent who acts on a client's behalf is supposed to represent the client's interest," Clara said. "Not tell the client the offer is $40 when it's $92 and keep the difference." "It's more complicated than that," Nathan said. "Is it?" she said. "Because Tom Henry has 11 acres in that corridor, and you told him the offer was $40 an acre. The company's filed rate is $92. That's $520 Tom Henry is not going to receive because you told him the offer was lower than it was. Tom Henry, who is a decent man working a modest ranch with 3 children, one of whom sits in that desk right there every day and learns things because he finally has the chance to learn them. That's the complication you want me to see as complicated." Nathan's jaw tightened. "I came here to offer you something," he said. "Did you?" Clara said. "I'll make it right with the landowners," he said. "The full rate. I'll cover the difference myself if the company won't adjust. And I'll arrange a permanent land grant for the strip next to this building, so the school's position here isn't in question." Clara looked at him. She thought about the 8 months of letters. She thought about the platform. She thought about the council meeting, and the 4 to 3, and Nathan's voice saying she doesn't belong here in Martha's cafe. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "Because I would prefer not to have this aired in a public meeting." There it was. The part she'd known was there. "I appreciate you being direct about that," she said. "So let me be direct in return." She picked up the eraser and turned back to the slate board. "The meeting is tomorrow. Tom Henry and Ed Sutter deserve to have this matter resolved in a way where they understand what happened and where it's on record. The other 3 families who already signed deserve the same. I'm not interested in private arrangements that disappear in a month because they were never written down anywhere that anyone else could see." "Miss Whitmore, I'll see you at the meeting, Mr. Caldwell," she said, and went on erasing the slate. He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she heard his boots on the floor in the door, and he was gone. She finished erasing the board and set the eraser down and stood at the front of the empty room and looked at the desks and the maps and the books and the rough shelf Cole had built. And she thought that she was very tired of men who believed that a private arrangement was the same thing as a resolution. The only difference between a resolution and an arrangement was whether the people who needed to understand it actually got to understand it. Tomorrow, they would understand it. She picked up her coat and her bag, and she locked the Wren building and walked home through the cold. And she thought about 14 children and a survey on page 14 and a man standing in a doorway who had, for just a moment, looked like he understood what he'd done. And she thought that understanding was not the same thing as accountability, and that accountability was what tomorrow was for. The council meeting was held on the third Thursday of December, at 8 in the morning, in Lester Price's mill room. By 7:45, the room was full. Clara had not expected that. She had expected the council members, Aldous, Cole, Tom Henry, and Ed Sutter, maybe Martha and Denning. What she found when she arrived was something closer to 30 people packed into a space that held 20 comfortably, with more standing in the doorway and at least a handful clustered on the street outside where someone had left the outer door open despite the cold. Word had moved through Red Hollow. The way word moved in small towns, not through any single channel, but through all of them simultaneously, through the cafe and the feed store and the post office, and the particular telephone of women talking to each other across fences and in doorways. And what had come out the other side was enough to fill a room on a December morning before most people had finished breakfast. Clara stood at the front of the room near the single chair, which was where she had sat 2 months ago, and she looked at the faces. She recognized most of them now. 2 months of working at Martha's Cafe had given her that, not deep knowledge of people, but the surface knowledge that mattered in a practical situation, the knowledge of who stood next to whom and who watched whose reaction before forming their own. Tom Henry was there with Ruth beside him, which was unusual for a council meeting and which Tom had clearly decided was necessary. Ed Sutter was there with his oldest son. Bert Hadley was there, standing against the wall with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who was obscurely pleased that something he'd started by talking to Cole at 7 in the morning had led to this. Bill Macer was there, and Ray Birch, and Jim Toller, who came in late and stood near the back with a face that gave nothing away. Nathan Caldwell came in at 7:58 with one man beside him. Not the two hands from before, but a different man, narrower, in a better coat, who carried a leather case, and who Clara understood immediately was a lawyer Nathan had brought from somewhere. Frank Aldous, standing beside Denning at the side of the room, saw the leather case at the same moment Clara did. Aldous was a small, deliberate man in his 50s, with the kind of stillness that came from spending a career in rooms where things were decided. He looked at the other lawyer, assessed him with the speed of long practice, and then looked back at the papers in his own hand with an expression that didn't change. Lester Price called the meeting to order at 8 o'clock, with the efficiency of a man who understood that the faster he moved things along, the less opportunity there was for them to get away from him entirely. "This is a special session," he said, called to address a formal complaint filed by residents Tom Henry and Edward Sutter regarding land negotiation practices in the Valley Corridor. Frank Aldous of Clearwater is here in a legal advisory capacity. The council will hear the complaint, hear any response, and determine what action, if any, is within our authority to take. He looked around the room. This is not a court. We are a town council. We can establish fact for the record and make recommendations. We cannot adjudicate criminal matters, and I want that understood before we begin. Clara registered the word criminal sitting in the room and noted that Lester had chosen to put it there himself, preemptively, which told her something about how much Lester had already been thinking about this. Aldous presented the case. He did it in the measured, sequential way of a man who understood that a room full of people who were not lawyers needed information delivered in the order that made it make sense, not the order that made it most dramatic. He showed the survey, passed copies around the table so each council member could see the page 14 compensation schedule with their own eyes. He read Tom Henry's statement aloud, which Tom had written in his own hand and which had the particular weight of plain language used by a man who chose his words because he meant them. He read Ed Sutter's statement. He laid out the arithmetic, what the company had agreed to pay per acre, what Nathan had told each landowner, what the difference amounted to on each parcel, and what the cumulative difference was across all 7 parcels, including the 3 that had already signed. The cumulative difference was $4,230. Aldous read that number aloud, and the room received it with the particular silence of people processing something that was larger than they'd expected. Clara watched the council members. Lester's face had gone very still. Bill Macer was looking at the survey copy in his hands. Arthur Denning, at the end of the table, had his pen down and was watching Nathan Caldwell. Nathan's lawyer, his name was Greer, he'd introduced himself briefly, stood when Aldous finished and made the argument Nathan had previewed the evening before in the Wren building, that Nathan had acted as an intermediary, not as the landowner's agent, that the difference between the offered rate and the filed rate represented a reasonable coordination fee for bringing the corridor deal together, that without Nathan's work organizing the corridor, the railroad would not have come to this valley at all, and the landowners would have received nothing rather than $40 or $45 an acre. Greer was competent. It was not brilliant, but he was competent, and he made the argument with enough professional smoothness that Clara could see some of the room being uncertain, the way rooms were uncertain when a confident voice told them that what they thought was simple was actually complicated. Then Tom Henry stood up. He was not a man who spoke publicly as a rule, and the room knew that, and because the room knew it, the room paid attention. "I want to say one thing," Tom said. He was looking at Nathan, not at the council. "Nathan Caldwell came to my house and sat at my kitchen table. He told me he was helping me understand the offer. That's what he said. Helping me understand it." He paused. "A man who is helping you understand something is supposed to be on your side of the table, not the other one." He sat back down. The room was quiet for a moment, and then it was not quiet, which happened all at once in the way that rooms went from quiet to not quiet, when something had been said that everyone was thinking and nobody had yet put words to. Lester had to call for order twice. Greer made another argument. Aldous responded to it. They went back and forth for 20 minutes in the careful, circling way that legal arguments moved, and Clara sat in her chair and listened and watched the council members and tracked the small movements that told her where things were going. At one point, Nathan looked at her from across the room. It was a direct look, not hostile exactly, but measuring. The look of a man trying to calculate something he needed more information to calculate. She looked back at him steadily and gave him nothing to calculate with. Lester called a recess at 9:30. People moved around the room, and Clara stood and stretched her back, which had been tight all morning, and Martha appeared from somewhere with a coffee that she handed to Clara without asking and then disappeared again, which was the most Martha thing that had ever happened. Cole came and stood beside her. "How does it look?" she said quietly. "Lester's decided," Cole said just as quietly. "I can tell by how he's been sitting for the last 20 minutes. "Which way?" "Your way," Cole said. "But he's going to frame it as the town's interest rather than as a judgment on Nathan. Lester doesn't condemn people publicly if he can avoid it. He just redirects." "Redirects how?" Clara said. "Watch," Cole said. When the session resumed, Lester let Greer make one more abbreviated argument, and then he held up his hand in the way he held up his hand when something was finished. "I'm going to say what I think," Lester said, "and then we'll vote on what's within our authority to vote on." He looked at his papers for a moment. "The railroad coming through this valley is probably a good thing for Red Hollow. More people, more commerce, more reason for businesses to stay open and grow. I'm not opposed to the railroad." He looked up. "What I'm opposed to is any individual in this valley representing himself as working on behalf of people while he's actually working on behalf of himself. That's not a legal judgment. I'm not a lawyer and this isn't a court. That's a character judgment. And in 20 years of running this council, I've found that character judgments matter as much as legal ones in a community this size." Nathan said nothing. His lawyer was looking at his papers. "The council has 3 things it can do today," Lester said. "First, we can formally request that the railroad company renegotiate with all 7 valley landowners at the filed rate of $92 an acre, and that any prior agreements signed at lower rates be voided and renegotiated. Aldous tells me we can make that request with legal standing because the corridor includes county common land, and the county has not consented to the corridor at the filed rate." He looked at Aldous, who nodded. "Second, we can establish a formal record of this complaint, with all the documentation, which will be available to any landowner or their legal representative going forward." He looked at Tom Henry. "Third, we can pass a resolution establishing that the county common strip adjacent to the Wren building is permanently designated as school-adjacent land and cannot be transferred, encumbered, or otherwise dealt without a unanimous council vote and a 30-day public notice period." The school strip. Clara had not known Lester was going to propose that. She sat very still. "I move all 3, Bill Macer said. "Seconded," Denning said immediately. Discussion? Lester said. Jim Toller said, the railroad company may push back on the renegotiation request. They may, Lester said. That's their right, but they need that county strip and they know it, and the county doesn't have to give it to them on terms we don't set ourselves. Ray Birch said nothing. He was looking at the table. The vote was 6-1, which was better than Clara had calculated. She didn't know which council member voted against, and she found she didn't particularly need to know. The resolution passed. The room after was not celebratory in any clean sense. It was a town room that had just put something difficult on record and was processing what that meant, which for some people meant relief, and for others meant a shift in their understanding of someone they'd known for years. And for at least a few people it seemed to mean simply that they wanted to get back to their regular morning before the cold got worse. Nathan left without speaking to anyone on the council. Greer followed him, leather case under his arm, and Clara watched them go and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, which was what she'd been half-braced against feeling, because triumph had always seemed like a response more appropriate to games than to situations where real people had been genuinely wronged. But something quieter. Something closer to the feeling of a window being opened in a room that had been closed too long. Tom Henry stopped beside her on his way out. "Thank you," he said. It came out roughly, the way things came out from Tom Henry when he meant them all the way down. "The statement you wrote did more than anything I said," Clara said. "You're the one who found out to write it," he said. Ruth was beside him, and she touched Clara's arm briefly, just once, and then they went out into the December cold. Aldous stopped to speak with Clara before he left. He shook her hand with the directness of a man who didn't perform warmth, but offered the real version of it when he felt it was warranted. "The railroad will renegotiate," he said. "They need the corridor more than they need the original terms. Nathan may try to maintain some role in the negotiation, but his leverage in this valley is significantly diminished now." He paused. "I want to say something else." "Go ahead," Clara said. "You didn't have to make this public," he said. "Nathan offered you a private settlement that would have protected the school and made the landowners financially whole. You could have taken it." "I know," she said. "Why didn't you?" Clara thought about how to say what she'd been thinking since the night in the Wren building. Because in 6 months or a year, once everyone had moved on, Nathan would have been back to the same position he was in before. Still the man in the valley who arranged things. Still the one people deferred to because they didn't know what he was doing or why. She looked at the room, which was emptying out. A private settlement would have fixed the money. It wouldn't have fixed the information. And people need information to make their own decisions. Aldous considered that for a moment. "That's a teacherly answer," he said. Not disparagingly. "I'm a teacher," she said. He left, and Martha appeared from somewhere and started straightening the chairs that had been moved around, and Clara helped her, and they worked in the comfortable silence of two women doing a practical task in the aftermath of something larger. "Well," Martha said, when they'd gotten the chairs back in their rows. "Well," Clara said. "You want coffee?" "I have school in 40 minutes, Clara said. "Then I'll make it fast," Martha said. The railroad company responded to the council's formal request 11 days later by letter to Lester Price, which Lester read aloud at a brief special session attended by all 7 Valley landowners, their families, and what appeared to be most of Red Hollow. The company agreed to renegotiate all agreements at the filed rate. The 3 landowners who had signed at lower rates would receive amended agreements and the balance of what they were owed within 60 days. The company also confirmed that the county common strip adjacent to the Wren building would be routed around in the final corridor plan, which added a marginal cost to the rail line that the company absorbed without comment, which Aldous said later meant the original corridor routing had always been negotiable, and Nathan had simply never introduced the possibility. Tom Henry's amended payment was $1,012. He came to the Wren building during the lunch recess to tell Clara, and he stood in the doorway looking at the children eating at their desks. And he said it with the contained steadiness of a man who had learned not to show too much when things went right, because experience had taught him things could still go wrong. But his eyes were different when he looked at her, and Clara understood. Will was at his desk eating an apple and reading simultaneously, which was a skill he had apparently been practicing since birth. He glanced up when his father came in, and then went back to his book, which was the most Will thing he had ever done in Clara's presence, and she felt a brief fierce affection for him that she kept entirely off her face. Nathan Caldwell left Red Hollow in January. Not immediately. He stayed through December, going about his business with the diminished but intact composure of a man who had absorbed a significant loss and was refusing to let it show more than he could help. He was at the general store and at the feedlot and, once, briefly, at the edge of the street outside the Wren building, where he stood for a moment looking at the light in the windows and then walked on. Clara saw him from inside. She did not stop teaching. In January, he sold his ranch to a family from Idaho who had 3 children and who enrolled all 3 of them in the Red Hollow School within their first week in town. Clara did not know where Nathan went after the sale. She heard Billings mentioned once, and then she stopped hearing anything at all, which was the way departures worked in small towns. Fully present one day, and then simply not there. And life continued because life always did. She did not feel sorry for him. She had spent a long time examining whether she ought to feel sorry for him, because she was not a person who was comfortable with hard feelings that she hadn't examined thoroughly. And what she found was that what she felt was something more like sadness. Not for him specifically, but for the version of him that had written 8 months of careful letters about character and what it meant. That version of him had believed what he wrote, she thought, or he'd believed it in the abstract, in the way people believe things about themselves that were easier to believe at a distance than to actually live. She had learned things from those letters too, in the end. That was not nothing. Cole came to the school on a Friday afternoon in late January, the last week of the first month of classes. He arrived at the end of the school day, when the children were filing out into the cold with their slates and their coats, and the particular released energy of children who had been sitting still for 6 hours and could now stop. He stood to the side of the door and let them go by, and Will Henry stopped and said, "Mr. Maverick," with the solemn formality he used with adults he respected. And Cole said, "Will," and Will went out. When the last child was gone, Clara was at the front of the room, erasing the day's work from the slate board. And she did not stop when Cole came in, because she'd been aware of him there, and because she needed to finish the board before the chalk dust settled. "You said when it was done," Cole said. He was standing in the middle of the room, holding his hat, not moving toward her. "I did," Clara said. She finished the last corner of the board and set the eraser down and turned around. "It's done." He was looking at her the way he had looked at her since that first morning on the platform, not around her or past her or at the part of her face that most people looked at first, but at her, as a whole, the way you looked at someone you had decided to actually see. "I built something on my land," he said, "on the north end, past the pasture, where the pines start. There's a clearing that gets afternoon light even in winter." He stopped. "I've been meaning to build there for years. I started in October and I finished it last week." He was quiet a moment. "It's not large. It needs paint in the spring. The kitchen is smaller than it should be." Clara waited. "I'd like you to see it," he said. "And I'd like—" He stopped again. Not because he didn't know what to say, she understood, but because he was saying it carefully, the way he did things he meant completely. "I'd like to know if you'd consider making it yours, ours." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking because you need somewhere to live, or because the room above Henry's stable is cold, though it is. I'm asking because the last 4 months have been the first time in years I've understood what it was I was missing." He paused. "That's an honest thing, and I'm not going to make it prettier than it is." Clara stood at the front of the room she had built from a vacant building with rough-made desks and borrowed chalk, in the town that had abandoned her on a platform 4 months ago, and she looked at this man, this scarred, deliberate, imperfect man who had said, "Looks like someone forgot that a person is more than what they see on a cold platform," and then had not once, in 4 months, contradicted that statement by a single action. And she thought about what she knew of him. She knew he co-signed a note for a neighbor he didn't have to help. She knew he built a shelf on a Saturday because a school needed one. She knew he made his case in rooms and then stepped back when she told him she would speak for herself. She knew he came to a council meeting at 8 in the morning for a woman he'd met 3 weeks before. And she knew he fixed problems quietly and didn't make speeches about it. And she knew that the things she'd learned about him she'd learned from other people rather than from him, which was the most reliable way to learn things about a person. She also knew he had a temper he controlled carefully, that he was sometimes so self-contained it felt like distance, that he didn't talk enough when something was bothering him, and that he had spent years alone on that ranch, and some of those habits were probably going to take a long time to move. She was not perfect either. She overprepared for things and underprepared for the people around her. She held on to slights longer than she wanted to. She was better with children's problems than with adult ones, and she knew it. She would fight about things that didn't need fighting about sometimes, and then be too quiet about the ones that did. None of that was a reason not to say yes. "I'd like to see it," she said. He was very still for a moment. "Saturday?" he said. "Saturday," she said. He nodded, once, slowly, and then the corner of his mouth moved into the thing she had spent 4 months watching. The not-quite smile that she had learned was not a withheld smile at all, but simply the way his face showed that something had landed well. And this time it went a little further than usual, enough to be actual and unguarded, and very briefly there before it settled. He put his hat on. "I'll bring the horse for you," he said. 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock, she said. He left, and Clara stood in the empty room in the winter afternoon quiet, and she looked at the desks and the maps and the slate board she'd just erased, and the shelf Cole had built, and the window that let in the pale January light, and she thought about the word home, about what it had meant to her at 19, when it was the house she'd run into burning, and at 26, when the school board in Ohio had told her she was unsuitable, and at 31, stepping off a train in Montana with one trunk and a fragile hope that a man's letters had been true. Home had never been the place. She'd known that, somewhere below the level of clear thought, for a long time. The places had mattered, had given her structure and work and the daily necessity of showing up. But the places were not the thing. The thing was harder to name than a place. It was this, maybe. This room with its rough desks where 14 children sat every morning and learned that they were capable of understanding things they hadn't understood the day before. It was Ruth Henry touching her arm. It was Martha making coffee before she asked. It was the survey on page 14 and the look on Tom Henry's face when he understood what it meant. And the look on Will Henry's face when he didn't try to hide that he was glad the school existed. It was a man standing in a room saying, "That's an honest thing and I'm not going to make it prettier than it is." Home was not where the scars didn't show. Clara understood that now, with the clarity of something she'd always halfway known and had finally arrived at completely. Home was where showing them didn't cost you anything, where the truth of what you'd survived was just part of who you were, unremarkable, simply yours. She had been looking for that in a letter. She had not found it there. She had found it, instead, by staying in a place she'd been left behind in, by working at an honest job and making a practical case, and refusing one private arrangement after another when the public one was what the situation actually required. She had found it by being exactly who she was in a room full of people who needed to see it. That was not a simple story. It was not the story she'd been trying to write when she stepped off the train. But it was true. And she had learned, was still learning, that true was worth more than she'd once thought it was. She put on her coat and gathered her bag and picked up the day's lesson notes to revise for Monday. On Saturday morning, Cole came at 8 exhaustlessly, which she would have expected, with the bay mare he'd brought for her the morning of the council meeting. The cold had broken slightly overnight, still deep winter, but the particular savageness of January had eased by a few degrees, and the sky was pale blue and clear above the valley and the mountains. They rode north out of town and into the open land, and after a while she could see the pines Cole had mentioned, and then the clearing, and then the house. It was plain. Not small, actually, larger than she'd expected from the way he'd described it. Though the kitchen, she saw when he showed her through, was indeed compact. The floors were pine, sanded, but not yet finished. The windows faced south and west, and in the afternoon they would get what he'd said about the light. There was a room off the main that was clearly intended for nothing in particular yet, which she understood he'd left that way deliberately, and she looked at it and thought about the books she owned and the lesson materials and the papers she brought home to grade and said nothing about any of it, because it was Saturday, and there was time. He walked her through it without commentary, showing her things without explaining them, letting her look. She liked that. She had been in houses where the showing was really a kind of performance, where the owner wanted you to be impressed in specific ways. This was different. Cole walked through the rooms the way he walked through most situations, present, attentive, not pushing. In the main room, she stood at the south window and looked at the clearing and the tree line and the valley below it, and behind her she heard him stop moving. "Well?" he said. She turned. "The kitchen really is small," she said. "I know," he said. We can fix that, she said, in the spring. The word we sat between them for a moment, and she watched him receive it and hold it the way he held things that mattered, carefully, without rushing to respond. Yes, he said. We can. Outside, the valley spread south toward Red Hollow, which she could see at the distance. The mill at one end, the line of storefronts, and there, at the east end just visible, the Wren building with its repaired windows and its new stove, and the 14 desks inside it, waiting for Monday. She thought about what it meant to live somewhere you had chosen versus somewhere you'd arrived by arrangement or necessity. She thought about the difference between the hope she'd carried on the train in October, fragile as she'd known even then, built on letters and the willingness of a man she'd never met, and what she was standing in now. This was not fragile. This had been built on things she could actually account for. Work done, arguments made, a room full of children who showed up every morning, a man whose actions had been consistent with his words in every particular she'd observed. That was not the same as certainty. She was not certain. She had been certain before, or had told herself she was. And certainty had deposited her on a train platform with one trunk and nowhere to go. What she had now was better than certainty. It was evidence. She had built something in Red Hollow. Not the thing she'd come to build. That plan had been someone else's idea of her future, a stranger's handwriting on an envelope. What she'd built was her own. Piece by piece, morning by morning, in the cafe and the classroom and the back table at Martha's and the council room and the Wren building with its smell of lye soap and wood shavings. She had built a place where people knew who she was and had decided it was enough, more than enough, to have her here. The scars on her face were still there. They would always be there. She had stopped, somewhere in the past 4 months, thinking about them as the first fact about her, as the thing that preceded her into rooms and defined what happened when she arrived. They were part of her the way the fire was part of her, not something to put behind her or be ashamed of or make the center of everything, just part of the account of what she had lived through and who she had become on the other side of it. She thought about 19-year-old Clara running into a burning house, and about what that girl had understood, even then, that some things were worth the cost. Her brother had been worth it. She would do it again. She had spent years letting other people treat that act as a tragedy. She was done with that. "Cole?" she said. He came and stood beside her at the window, close enough that she was aware of him without having to look. "I'm going to say yes," she said. "I want you to know it's not because I need a house or because the room above Henry's stable is cold, though it is." "I know it," he said. "I'm saying yes because I think we're the kind of people who are better together than apart," she said. "Not easier, better." "There's a difference," he said. "A significant one," she said. He looked at the valley below them. "I've been alone on this land for 9 years," he said. "I don't know everything I've gotten wrong because of that. I expect some of it will come out." "I expect it will," she said. "Same for me." "I'm not much for talking through things," he said. "I work on it." "I overtalk things and then go silent at the wrong moments," she said. "We'll have a complete set of problems between us." He looked at her then, and the thing that moved across his face was the most fully realized version of the expression she'd been watching for 4 months, real and unguarded and a little uncertain, the way real things were uncertain, because certainty and genuineness were not the same thing, and he understood that as well as she did. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That's a yes," she said. They stood there in the clear winter morning in the house he had built in the clearing where the pines started, and Clara looked at the valley below and thought that she had not arrived here the way she'd planned. The arrival she'd planned had ended on a train platform in October with a man's cold expression and an envelope she hadn't taken. Everything after that had been unplanned and honestly earned, in the way that the things you built yourself were earned, not given. She thought about what she'd tell her students someday, not in a lesson, but in the offhand way that real things got transmitted. That the worth of a person was not in their unbroken skin or their smooth story or the way they looked arriving somewhere new. It was in what they did after the worst thing happened, whether they stood back up, whether they stayed honest, whether they kept showing up for the work even when the work was hard and the room was cold and the morning came before they were ready for it. She would not have to make a speech about it. They would see it. Children always saw more than you told them. They had been watching her since the first Monday of December. watching the way she moved through a room, the way she handled the boy who was resistant, and the girl who was frightened, and the youngest one who cried the first day and then never cried again. They had been learning things she wasn't teaching, which was always the most important thing children learned in any classroom. That was enough, more than enough. The bay mare stamped once at the edge of the clearing, impatient with the cold. "She wants to go back," Clara said. "She does that," Cole said. "She's got opinions about the cold." "Smart horse," Clara said. She stepped back from the window and picked up her coat from the chair where she'd draped it, and she looked around the main room one more time, the pine floors, the south windows, the empty room with its waiting space, and she thought yes. She thought home. She thought the kitchen really was small, but they would fix it in spring, and that was a fine thing to have ahead of them, a practical problem with a practical solution and time to solve it. She put on her coat, and they went out into the clear January morning, and they rode back toward Red Hollow together through the pale cold light, and the town came up ahead of them the way it always did. The mill, the storefronts, the Wren building at the east end, and it looked from this distance like what it was, a hard, unglamorous, imperfect place full of people who were doing their best with what they had, and who had, in the past few months, decided to do a little better. Clara had not come here to love it, but she did.